Okay, Scott. And if you don't want to be viewed on the screen, just, put your picture on.
Thanks, Teresa. The screen sharing is disabled. If you could.
Oh, I thought I shared it. Sorry.
Oh, wow.
There you go. You should be set now.
Okay. Sure, that looks like we're going here. So first, let me check here. First of all, is my screen sharing?
Yes, sir, it is.
And you can hear me, I guess.
Yes,
So again,
sir.
my name is Scott Metzel. Arida Vasquez and I are the co-chairs of the System Performance Committee of the Continuum of Care for the City and County of Racine. This committee looks at data on homelessness and the performance of Racine as a whole in homeless services on a couple key performance indicators. And every year we give an annual report from the previous year. And back in March, we gave our report. One of the indicators that we look at or the things we track are the number of people homeless. When we gave that piece of information, I also sort of did a comparison to the population and noted some disparity that we could see. And we were asked to look into this more and present some more information on that. So we've been looking at it and seeing what we could do, what kind of data was available and how we would present it. And this is what we came up with. So we're going to take a look at disparity in Racine, ethnic and racial disparity in homelessness and homeless services in Racine County. So the presentation is going to be in two parts. The first part will look at some data. I'll give an introduction, explain what we're going to be looking at, some of the limitations. We'll look at ethnic disparity data, racial disparity data, then some key points from that data. Then we'll take a brief break to get some coffee or whatever. And then I'll come back and see, okay, now that we see this kind of disparity, what do we do with it? And we'll take a closer look at project level. We'll be looking at overall data for homeless services in Racine, as well as some program levels, but then we'll look specifically at one project, one provider, street outreach, and take a look at that and how we use some of that information and take a little bit of a deeper look. Then we'll see how we can go forward, what we might do from there, and then take any questions and comments. So if you have questions and comments as we go along, you can type them in chat and we'll get to them at the end, or just let me know when we get there. So let's start with part one. We'll take a look at exploring disparity in homelessness and homeless services in Racine. First, I'm going to start with some of the definitions we're using, the context, the data sources, limitations, those kind of things. First, we're looking at disparity. That's the main point that we have here. And disparity is a difference between things that look dissimilar. When I was a kid, we had Sesame Street you used to watch, and they say one of these things is not like the other ones. That's disparity. What looks different? What doesn't look equal? So we're going to be looking for differences in data, specifically with ethnicity and race. Equity is another word that we have, which goes beyond just equality or having the same data, which might be an indicator if there's a disparity in data. It's not equal, but is it fair? Is it just, impartial? We're looking at the value behind it. In this presentation, we're talking about homelessness according to the Hearth Act definition. That's the definition that HUD uses for most of our grants. And essentially, this is just in brief. When we talk about someone who's homeless in this presentation, it means either living in a government or privately funded emergency shelter, living in transitional housing, or living in a place not meant for human habitation, unsheltered. This presentation does not count people who are doubled up or couch surfing. We talk about HMIS, that's Homeless Management Information System. That's a database of people experiencing homelessness and the services provided to them. Positive outcomes we'll talk about in this presentation. And positive outcomes are a little bit different by program type, and they look at the exit destination. That means when someone leaves a program, where did they go? What was their housing situation? And for street outreach, has sort of the easiest of all positive outcomes from street outreach. It means if you're not in the street outreach program or you don't have contact with street outreach anymore, it means you left the streets to any kind of destination, temporary or permanent, just about anything except for jail, basically. For emergency shelter, which we abbreviate as ES, or transitional housing, which is TH, rapid rehousing, RRH, you'll see these abbreviations used in the presentation. When you leave the program, a positive outcome would be going to a permanent housing destination. And for permanent supportive housing programs, a positive outcome would be either staying in permanent supportive housing or leaving it to a permanent housing destination. Just to keep in mind the context, we're looking at a period here in 2021, July 2021 to June 2022. This is the sort of late pandemic or post-pandemic period, however you want to look at it. And it's the end of a lot of those pandemic supports and protections. In this period, the moratorium, eviction moratorium ended. There were increasing housing challenges, and we began to see homelessness start to return to its pre-pandemic levels. We have a few sets of data sources that we're using. We use the American Community Survey 5-year estimates. This is census data. We use the point in time count that took place on January 26, 2022. We use HMIS data from July 1st, 2021 to June 30th, 2022, and some street outreach shift reports and data for that same period. Our service providers. When we're talking about a shelter programs here, we're talking about HALO, Safe Haven, Burlington TLC, and Women's Resource Center. But Women's Resource Center is only included in the point in time data. They're not in annual HMIS data. When we talk about transitional housing in this presentation, we're talking about the Union Grove Grant Per Diem program. That's in all of our data, and Bethany Apartments in the point in time data. When we talk about permanent housing, rapid rehousing, there are a number of different programs and different types that fall under the category of rapid rehousing. It would include HALO has some, Safe Haven has some, HOPES has some, Lutheran Social Service has some, and CDI has some programs that count as rapid rehousing. That's usually short to medium term rental assistance and case management. Finally, permanent supportive housing or PSH, HALO, CDI, and the VASH vouchers or Veterans Affairs Supportive Housing is what we count under PSH. And finally, outreach, it's Hope Center that does the outreach. Unsheltered count, when we talk about this year, it's what we got from point in time. So some limitations. One, we're using quantitative data here. We don't really have any qualitative data that gives interpretations or perspectives or explanations, especially from people with lived experiences. So we don't really know why in many cases. HMIS versus non-HMIS. The annual data that we use on outcomes does not include services provided by non-HMIS participating agencies. That would be Women's Resource Center and Bethany Apartments because they serve victims of domestic violence as well as veteran outreach or community action. Also, we have a limited focus in this presentation due to time and data constraints. We're only looking at equity and diversity being under race and ethnicity. And we really focus on 3 system performance measures: the number of people homeless, program outcomes or positive outcomes, and the length of time homeless. And finally, intersectionality. In this report, we're really looking at ethnicity and race in isolation. We don't really combine the two or look at race and gender or household size and other factors combined that often tell us more about the story. So let's get kicked off here with ethnic disparity, a look at ethnic disparity in homelessness and homeless services in Racine. Just as a note, when we talk about ethnicity here in the context of homeless data, we're really talking about whether someone is Hispanic, Latino, Latinx versus non-Hispanic. That's what we mean by ethnicity. And we'll start with ethnicity and homelessness in Racine County. We're looking at the Hispanic, Latino, Latinx population as a percentage of the entire population of each of these groups. So on the left, we see that the Hispanic population is 13% of the population of Racine County. When we move to the population living in poverty, the Hispanic population is 20%. Then we move to the population that is experiencing homelessness, and this is from the point in time count, we have 14%. Then out of that population that's experiencing homelessness, 7% of the positive outcomes were with the Hispanic population. Now, this is really interesting in the homeless population. If we break that down, the numbers here on the point in time count was 27 people out of 193. Out of those 27 people, 21 or 78% were in household with children. So the majority of the Hispanic population that was homeless here in Racine were in households with children or families. And 63% of that Hispanic population that was homeless was in transitional housing. So that's going to be interesting in this presentation, and we'll see how that plays out. What we see is that the Hispanic population was more likely to experience poverty, homelessness, and their percentage of the population are the same. Positive outcomes a little bit less. Now, when we look at program use, these are actually the number of people who are using different programs. So during the year of July 1st to 2021, sorry, there's a mistake in that footnote, to June 30th, 2022, we had 7 people who had contact with street outreach, that's the SO, who were Hispanic, 41 in emergency shelter, 1 in transitional housing, 16 in rapid rehousing, and 7 in permanent supportive housing. So the first thing that you might notice is that TH says 1 when we saw there were 16 people in the previous slide. And this is the difference between non-HMIS data and annual data. This data here that we're looking at, the annual data, doesn't include service providers for victims of domestic violence. So we can see that this transitional housing here is only Union Grove, and that the majority of those people who were in the point in time count would have been at Bethany Apartments. So it's a very, very interesting. You can see a large portion of the Hispanic population was at Bethany. When we look at program outcomes, the positive outcomes from programs on the left of this chart at 54%, that's the positive outcomes for all people who were Hispanic, Latina, Latino, Latinx, and who were homeless. Out of the people in street outreach, it was 33% positive outcomes, 47% positive outcomes in shelter. We didn't have any in transitional housing. Nobody had an outcome actually. 75% rapid rehousing and 100% in permanent housing. That was really just one person, and they had that. So if we look at this, they vary a lot from 33% at street outreach is the lowest to 100% in permanent housing being the highest. Now, when we compare the Hispanic population to the non-Hispanic population, we can see how the outcomes go. All the way on the left is all types of positive outcomes, all programs, sorry. We see 54%. When we go across this chart, what we can basically see is that the Hispanic population had better outcomes in all of these different program types except for street outreach. Street outreach, they really only had about half of the positive outcomes of the non-Hispanic population. Otherwise, they performed slightly better at slightly better positive outcomes. When we look at the length of time homeless, this is in days. We have the average length of time and the median length of time. In both cases, we can see that the Hispanic population had slightly shorter lengths of time homeless, about a week more or less, than the non-Hispanic population, both on average and as a median. So now let's look at racial data a little bit by racial groups. And this is the main data that we're looking at. This is our sort of global data, or where we're going to start. And all of these 4 graphs that you see here are distributions of the population. So each racial group, we're only looking at 5 here. Each of those graphs shows the percentage of that racial group out of all of the people in there. So we have population, people in poverty, people who are homelessness, and then the positive outcomes from people who were homeless. So if everything were equal, we would expect those color bars from population to be the same all the way down. That if poverty affected each racial group equally, then on that poverty bar, we should see 1% blue, 11% yellow, 1% green, 81% red, and 6% 12. But as you see, as we're going down, things don't come out equally. And the first thing that we see as we move from the population to the poverty to homelessness in Racine is sort of an inverse relationship between the Black, African-American, and African, and the white racial groups. Moving from population to poverty to homelessness, the percentage of the Black, African American, African population, each of those groups gets bigger as we move from the percentage of the population to the percentage of people experiencing homelessness. Where with the white racial group, the percentage gets smaller. From the population to poverty is smaller. Then from poverty to homelessness, smaller again. Definitely almost by the same percentage points, a very much inverse relationship. Something interesting with that blue group on the end, which are people who reported being multiracial, it sort of skips around. The numbers are very different. We have 6% of the population reporting that they're multiracial, and that's the population of Racine County. Then it jumps up to 12% in poverty and then decreases to 3.5% in homelessness. So that's a very interesting change. I'm not sure how that happened or why, but that's the data that we have. When we look at the homelessness moving to positive outcomes, we see a couple of things. One, in that yellow bar on the left, we see that the Black, African American, and African population had a decrease from the percentage of the population to positive outcomes by about 1.5%. The American Indian, Alaska Native, Indigenous population that's in the middle with that green bar had a decrease of about 0.5%. Asian on the left side, the light blue bar, also 0.5% to 0%. And that was all picked up in the multiracial group all the way on the right that actually had a gain of 2.5%. The white population, their positive outcomes or their percentage of positive outcomes was the same as their percentage of people homeless. So again, we're looking at distributions here, how the racial groups were distributed among people experiencing homelessness and how the positive outcomes were distributed. Now, let's look at the distribution of race by type of program. And what we're looking at here is we have a number of different programs that we'll look at: street outreach, emergency shelter programs, transitional housing, rapid rehousing, permanent supportive housing. Are all of those programs used equally by all races or even by the same race? And we're seeing whether services are equally used. So first of all, I'm going to look by each racial group one by one. This is the group that we had of American Indian, Native Alaskan, Indigenous. Not many people, so it's harder. The data looks bigger than it might actually be, but we do have a number of people who reported being American Indian, 4 in shelter, 1 in street outreach, 2 in rapid rehousing, 1 in rapid rehousing, 2 in transitional, none in permanent supportive housing. I'm looking at a couple of things as we go along. These are just sort of arbitrary comparisons, but street outreach contact was about 25% of shelter use. Rapid rehousing was about equal to street outreach, 25% of shelter use. It is interesting that there are no people reported being American Indian, Native Alaska, or Indigenous in permanent supportive housing. Asian American, there was only 1 person during the year in our annual data, and that person was in shelter. That person did not have a positive exit. So when we go through this presentation, I won't really talk about the Asian population much after that. It's really just a single person, and we don't have outcome data for that. Here's the Black African American population, and you can see there is definitely some difference in use of programs. You see a big jump up there in shelter. And here, street outreach contact was 7% of shelter use. If we go back to the American Indian population, it was 25% of the shelter use. Here it's 7%, so a big difference there. You can see rapid rehousing, about 43% of shelter use, and permanent supportive housing, about 40% of shelter use. Now, when we go to the group that reports being multiracial, we see street outreach contact was 33% of shelter use. Not too different from the American Indian population, but very different from the 7% in the Black and African American population. What I see here as a really big difference is look at shelter use compared to rapid rehousing use. Rapid rehousing is like 81% of shelter use. So those bars are much closer together here for the people who reported being multiracial. And here is the white group. Again, shelter is the highest. Shelter use is about 3 times higher than street outreach contact, about 33%. Rapid rehousing use is about 40% of shelter use. The interesting thing here is look at the comparison between permanent supportive housing and rapid rehousing, that they're relatively close, and none of the other groups really had that. So when we look at it by the number of people, things that I saw stood out to me when I looked at this data was American Indian, Alaska Native, Indigenous population, nobody was in permanent supportive housing. Asian population was only one person, and the person was in shelter. Black African American, African population had the largest disparity between shelter use and street outreach contact. The street outreach contacts were only 7% of the number of people in shelter, where the other ones were 25%, 33%, 40%, something like that. Huge difference in or disparity there in shelter use to street outreach use. Multiracial racial group had the highest percentage of rapid rehousing compared to other ones, a lot of rapid rehousing use, at least as a percentage. And the white population had the smallest disparity between rapid rehousing use and PSH use, a lot of permanent supportive housing used by the white population. So program use was a little bit different. Now we're going to look in these charts, again, we're back to distributions, and I'm looking at how the populations are distributed across the different programs. We just looked at each racial group by the number of people. This is each racial group as a percentage of all the people in the program. So here on the left, you'll see that that top chart is point in time data 2022. Next one is street outreach, then emergency shelter, transitional housing, rapid rehousing, permanent supportive housing. So that's our baseline data here. That is the population that is homeless. If all of the services were the same and everyone used them the same, we'd expect those same percentages to come down the line, but we don't. First thing we see is that street outreach is different from all of the other ones. Huge disparity in street outreach contacts compared to the other racial groups when we look at the distribution of race by program type and compared to the distribution of race of people who are experiencing homelessness. Again, most of it is that difference between the Black African American population and the white population, about a 20% difference that we're seeing there. When we look at emergency shelter and rapid rehousing, they're relatively close in terms of numbers. There's not that much difference between those two different programs. The percentage of people in emergency shelter who were Black African American was 53, same in rapid rehousing. The white population 42 to 40%, a 2% difference. The biggest difference is the multiracial group from 4% of the population in emergency shelters to 7% of the population in rapid rehousing. And again, we saw that connection of emergency shelter and rapid rehousing in some other data. Then transitional housing and permanent supportive housing, again, they're relatively close. Some differences. When we're looking at numbers in the hundreds like this of the number of people, I really start to get concerned if I see a difference of over 5%. But the differences in distribution that we have here, we see wide distributions in program use by people. Now let's look at outcomes by program types. Those are all the different program types we looked at. How do people perform in those? Do they get good outcomes? Do they get out of homelessness? Do they move to a better position? And is it different by program type and race? So first, we'll look at overall. This is homelessness and positive outcomes. Again, what we saw here was there's not a huge difference. We talked about this earlier, a 1.5% decline in homelessness to positive outcomes as a distribution among the Black population, a slight increase on the right-hand side there of it on the multiracial population. But otherwise, there's not a big difference. Even if you squint your eyes and look at that, it's not huge. The overall percentage of homelessness and overall positive outcomes, when we're looking at those percentages by racial group, isn't a huge difference. But now, all right, the white group, no disparity at all. Black African American decreases by 1.5, Asian American and American Indian decrease by 1.5, multiracial increases by 2.5%. Not big differences. But now let's go by program type and race. So what we're going to do in this slides, this group of slides, is take each racial group and see how their outcomes are in different programs. So here we have American Indian, Alaska Native, and Indigenous people. We have 33% positive outcomes overall, and they're all in emergency shelters. Street outreach has 0% positive outcomes. And the other ones, TH, that's transitional housing, RRH, rapid rehousing, PSH, rapid rehousing, you don't see anything there. That means that there are no outcomes at all. Either there was no one in the program or no one left the program to have an outcome. They were still in the program at the end of the period. Right, so that's what we have there. Street outreach had one person, one outcome, and it was not positive. So now let's look at the Black African American African population. Now you can see a little jumping around. We have outcomes in each of the programs. On the left, we have all programs, 48%. We have street outreach going up to 71%, emergency shelter, 39%. You know, the difference goes from 36% in emergency shelter to 78% positive outcomes in rapid rehousing. So now we see a lot of variance. So from program to program, the positive outcomes aren't always the same. So what we're looking at here is disparity. There's a difference. Things look different. You know, when we think about equity and access, then we want to get into why might these be different? Why might there be better outcomes in one program than another? It is interesting that street outreach was very low in comparison to shelter in terms of uses, but has a higher than average positive outcome in that group. This is the multiracial group. You know, when you compare, you go back to, let me go back here, with the Black African American African group, you can see it sort of bounces around up and down from program to program. When we go to these blue ones here, which is multiracial, there's less bouncing around. They're a little bit closer together in terms of outcomes. The deviation is from 59% to 72% instead of 36 to 78 or whatever. So fewer deviations in outcomes among this group and very high overall positive outcomes, 72% overall, 67% in shelter, and so on. 0% in transitional housing. That means if anyone did exit there, they didn't have a positive outcome, and no outcomes in permanent supportive housing. When we look at the white racial group, overall 48%, we see that the ones on the right-hand side, transitional housing, rapid rehousing, to an extent, permanent supportive housing, have better outcomes than the shelter and street outreach programs, and overall better performance in the housing programs there. So now, instead of looking at each race across each program, here we're looking at the different races in each program. So all programs, you'll see those green bars, if you can see the colors on your screen, are Native American, Alaskan, Native and Indigenous. Yellow bars are Black, African American, African, white, blue, sorry, is multiracial, and red is white. So when we look at the left, you'll see one that says all programs. We see that 72%, the multiracial group had much better positive outcomes overall. When we go to street outreach, that's SO, that yellow one, 71%, the best outcomes in street outreach were with the Black, African American, African population, followed by multiracial, followed by the white population. When we go to emergency shelter, that's where the multiracial population had much better as a percentage positive outcomes than all of the other groups, double for whatever reason. Transitional housing, it's the white group had the best outcomes there. Rapid rehousing, about equal for Black and white, a little bit lower for the multiracial group. And permanent supportive housing, we see the white groups doing the best. So there's a lot of disparity there. One thing you'll see in overall outcomes on the left is that the white and Black African American African groups had no disparity in overall outcomes. So I mean, that's what we call parity, 48% to 48% within those two groups. But then when you get to the individual programs, then there seems to be some variation and disparity. This is the same data, just a different way to look at it. Even if you kind of squint your eyes, I've broken into three groups. The ones on the left are like the 70th percentile of positive outcomes. You can note a couple of things. One, there's only two colors there, yellow and red, which would mean Black, African American, and white. In the middle group, which is like the 50, upper 50, the 60th percentile, you know, you can squint at that. You see that's where our blues, most of the blues come in. That's multiracial with some of the Black and African American outcomes there. And then if you look all the way at the right, which would be the lowest outcomes in the 30s or even lower, that's where all of the greens are, which is Native American, Alaska Native, and Indigenous. And if you look at it at program type, emergency shelter tends to be all the way on the right-hand side, the lower positive outcomes for three of the groups, although in the middle, emergency shelter comes up at a 67% for the multiracial group. So just you look at that, the distribution is interesting. On the left, the best outcomes are the housing groups, with the exception of street outreach outcomes for Black and African American and African population, which again is very strange, the smallest representation, but positive outcomes, where the other street outreach outcomes weren't quite as good.
Scott,
We
had a request to review the definition of a positive outcome.
Sure. Positive outcome is different from different groups. So in street outreach, a positive outcome is defined as leaving the streets to anywhere except for jail, basically. If we know that someone left the streets to someplace that wasn't jail, we know where it is, that's a positive outcome. Emergency shelter or rapid rehousing, transitional housing would be leaving a program to permanent housing and having permanent housing when you leave that program. With permanent supportive housing, it would include staying in permanent housing, but actually in this data, we're using the same definition as rapid rehousing, just because that's the way HUD did their reports. So for the housing programs and shelter, you're going to permanent housing. For street outreach, you're just off the streets, but not in jail. This is length of time homeless by racial group. We see again in the Black and white groups for the median length of time homeless, which is on the right, there's no disparity at all, 46 days on average, although there is disparity in the average length of time homeless. And what this seems to show is that for people who were white and were homeless during the period, there must have been some who had like really long periods of homelessness that took that average up a little bit. But when we look at the mean and we take off the lowest and the highest until we get to the middle was the same for both of those groups. We did have parity there. It's interesting that the American Indian, Alaska Native, or Indigenous had the lowest average, but the highest median. Again, that would mean that in the average, there were probably a few people who had very short stays in shelter or something, but in the median, overall, they probably had higher numbers. So now a couple key points here, or observations from this. First, looking at the ethnic disparity, we saw that the non-HMIS service providers, and this being particularly the providers of services for victims of domestic violence, play a really big role in serving people who are Hispanic, Latino, Latinx. You could see that in the difference from the point in time numbers and the annual numbers. We went from like 17 people in transitional housing to just one person. So they seem to play a big role. That would be Women's Resource Center, Bethany Apartments. And I think that might show that that population is under-reflected in our program outcomes, because they might be having positive outcomes or negative outcomes in those agencies that we wouldn't know about in our data. Another thing we see is that there's a lot of disparity across programs for the way the Hispanic population was using different programs. They did have high rates of positive outcomes across all programs except for street outreach. And overall, had shorter lengths of time homeless than the non-Hispanic population. In terms of racial disparity, some of the key points we could see here is a really wide distribution of race across programs. The way different races used programs was different. There's a lot of disparity or variation that from one program type to another, both looking at the race by itself and also the distribution across race. It is interesting that between the Black, African-American, African, and white racial groups, they did have parity, meaning the overall outcomes were exactly the same out of people who were homeless and had positive outcomes. And even the median length of time was exactly the same. There was some differences other places, but in those 2 points, very key indicators for us, they were the same. There was some disparity between the Native American and other racial groups. And the biggest thing we see is that the American Indian, Alaska Native, Indigenous racial group had fewer positive outcomes for all programs than other racial groups. And also with the multiracial group, they tended to have better outcomes for almost all of the programs. And again, wide disparity in outcomes by program from one group to another. So the big question that you would have, and unfortunately, I don't really have a full answer on this, is why. You know, one thing is we can see these disparities from one group to another, whether in program use or whether in outcomes, and to what extent are those racial or ethnic disparities in program use and outcomes related to access to those programs or program designs or features or the way the program is implemented versus other explanations that, well, it's a cultural thing that they don't like to use this service or whatever. That's really what we want to look at as a CoC and as individual programs is there something in this program that is either making it more interesting or more positive for one racial group over another, or that's blocking certain racial groups from using it or getting positive outcomes. And then we see how we can try to decrease the disparity and increase equity or fairness in our services for people who are experiencing homelessness in Racine. And now I'm actually going to talk a little bit about some explorations into that in one program. But first, we'll take a 5-minute break so I can drink some water and get some coffee. We'll be back in 5 minutes, and then we're actually going to go deeper into one program, and that program will be street outreach. So, Teresa, you have anything to say before we break here?
No, I don't have anything else to say.
So I'm just going to take a drink of water, get some coffee then, and we'll be back in a few minutes, and then take a closer look at street outreach and racial disparity. Thanks.
I wish I had Jeopardy music or something to play.
You could sing.
No, my cold makes me sound like I'm going through puberty again. So. Oh, there you go.
All right, so now we're going to take a look at least a closer look at some things, you know, maybe trying to seek solutions. We might not actually find some. But when we're doing this presentation with Arida, it actually took us a while because there's a lot of things we could include. And as I mentioned, we're really looking at ethnicity and racial disparity. Initially, we wanted to look at gender and some other issues and some of those intersectionalities that go along with it. We just didn't really have the time to go into it too deeply. But as we're going through the data, as someone who's involved with street outreach, some of those numbers jumped out at me and said, okay, let's take a closer look at this from the street outreach perspective. So what I want to look at now is mostly racial disparity in street outreach, thinking about it, street outreach through the lens of racial disparity. So first we'll start with some of the disparity data. This is what we looked at before. This is the first thing that I could say kind of set me off when I looked at this data, that this top bar there is point in time, 2022, the overall homeless population that we're using as our homeless data, or the distribution of race across the homeless population of Racine. Then in the bottom part is annual data of street outreach contacts over the course of a year distributed by race. So I look at that, and again, we see, I mean, even if you just squint your eyes and look at it, the yellow block at the top is much bigger than the yellow block at the bottom, and the red block at the top is smaller than the red block at the bottom. And those are the Black, African American, and white groups, that there are many fewer as a percentage Black, African American, African people within street outreach compared to white. And that's a major disparity. So that's why I decided, let's look at this a little more closely. Why is the street outreach population so different from the overall homeless population, especially with those two racial groups? So we see that significant disparity there comparing those two groups. So ethnic disparity, also we have some disparity here. Fewer Hispanic, Latino, Latinx people in street outreach than the overall population. We do add something else. We have that sort of yellow is Hispanic, blue is non-Hispanic. That light blue at the end, we have 10% unknown. Sometimes we have contact with people we don't know whether or not they're Hispanic or not in street outreach. Outcomes by ethnicity. Overall outcomes of people who are Hispanic, Latino, Latinx was 54% of people who are homeless. Street outreach is 33%. So, you know, a little under half of that, or yeah, a little under half of that, but it's not that good. When we look at positive outcomes by race, on the left, we have all programs, and on the right, we have street outreach. Comparing those again, you can see that there is a green bar on the left, that's all programs. That is the Native American, Alaskan Native Indigenous, 33%, and there's a 0% under street outreach. That is the American Indian group that didn't have a positive outcome. We look at the yellow bar. From all programs to street outreach, it actually increases by quite a bit. In the blue bar, which is multiracial, it decreases a little bit. And the red bar, which is the white group, increases slightly. So we see that for all programs, again, we had parity or the same results between the Black, African American, African group and the white group. But in street outreach, both groups had better outcomes than overall. But now there's some disparity. The Black, African American, African group has much better outcomes than the white group. There's a gap of almost 20%, which is significant. We had the decreases in the multiracial and the American Indian, Alaska Native Indigenous groups. So the question is, we have this disparity, especially in the Black and white groups. Fewer people are Black using street outreach or having street outreach contact in comparison to the overall homeless population, but better outcomes overall. Very strange. So when we look at this and start thinking about street outreach, that's why I want to look at those questions, that disparity from the homeless population to the street outreach population when we distribute it by race, and then that change in outcomes. There's a disparity in the changes that grows up. Why might it be there? And when I look at this, I think to talk about it, first, we really have to understand street outreach, how it works, and what we do. And street outreach, we serve people whose primary living place is a place not meant for human habitation, is outside. And it is interesting, it's a little different from other places that we do have people call us at Hope Center, lots of calls coming in every day, but the vast majority of people, like 98% or more, huge percentage of people who call us for assistance are not unsheltered. They're not living out on the streets. In fact, most of them are doubled up. But then when we do street outreach and we find people on the street, they didn't call us, and they almost never call us. So it's very interesting. We have lots of people call us who will say they're homeless in the sense of being doubled up or couch surfing. Some of them will even report sleeping in a car. The street outreach team will go out and find the car. There's nobody in the car, no blankets and things like that, parked in front of a house or apartment or whatever. People call, tend not to be unsheltered. The people who are unsheltered don't call. And then when we meet people on the streets, you know, people's idea of people who are unsheltered sort of have this vision of people just waiting for someone to swoop down and say, oh, here we are, and we're here to help you and get you into shelter and housing. Most of them say, I'm good, you know, I'm all right, and decline shelter, and a lot of times they'll even decline blankets or anything the first time we meet them. Very strange if you've never done it before, but in street outreach, it's very common to have people decline service the first time. So when we look at how we're going to do that, then it's how do we reach this population? So if people don't call us and they're out there somewhere, how do we find them? You know, how do we actually get them? And you have to think of this in terms of unsheltered locations. Street outreach has to go out and locate people as the first job. So we have to think about where people might be. And you might have seen this if you were in point in time, just some common features that go with it. Most people where they're sleeping, if they've been out for, you know, a week, will have a place that has some kind of cover or protection from the elements, from wind, from rain. If they're sleeping in a place that doesn't have cover immediately right where they are, they're usually close to a place where they could go to cover if it rains or if there's other kinds of precipitation, just to get out of the elements. Concealment, this isn't always true, but most people who are unsheltered in Racine are usually in a place that is not easily seen, hiding from other people, hiding from law enforcement. They're usually not immediately visible. That's fairly common. Another common thing is convenience. When people are unsheltered and have been unsheltered for a while, they tend to stay near places that meet their basic needs, a place to wash up, a place to use the bathroom, a place to get something to eat, a place to socialize with people. Even people who stay in their vehicles for any period of time tend to gravitate towards certain areas and be in areas that mean something to them. And the biggest one, and probably one of the most challenging, is safety. When people are unsheltered and sleeping outside, they want a place that makes them feel as safe as possible. But this varies from person to person and could have some cultural context and other things. Safety is very personal. And the way people interpret that then sort of sends them in certain directions where they might be sleeping outside at night. For example, to some people, safety means sleeping in a public place with a couple of other people. To other people, safety means going out and being by yourself, being as far from any other people as possible, going out and into the woods. Where other people who are out unsheltered might say, I'm not going to the woods, they're scared of the woods. You know, to them, the woods would not be safe. To other people, the woods would be safe. So it's very different from one person to another. So we really have to look at where people are staying and how that might differ from person to person and cover a wide variety of locations. So then, as we're going out and trying to find people in those locations, we sort of have a basic process that we follow in street outreach. First is to locate people. They're not calling us. We have to go and find them and go to them. The second is to make contact with them. You go out and you see someone who you may not know, probably don't know. Some people we do know. And you say, okay, that person looks like they're unsheltered. And at midnight, 1 o'clock in the morning, you go up and try to start a dialogue with them. So that's a process, and sort of there's different techniques and way to do it. How do you make contact and actually start with people once you see them? I remember when I first started street outreach, we started going to some parking lots looking for people sleeping in cars. The first time we'd done that at night. And first time we saw someone, we're like, hey, that looks like somebody sleeping in a car. Like, yeah, okay. Well, let's go talk to them. Well, what do we say? We had to sit there and debate and say, how are we going to make that contact? It's something that we develop over time. If we make contact with a person, we start a dialogue, then we make a determination. Is this person unsheltered? And that determination is going to determine whether that person ends up in our unsheltered data, in our street outreach data. If we don't believe that the person is unsheltered, we will not count them as a street outreach contact. If we believe they're unsheltered and sleeping outside, we count them. So that difference, that determination, yeah, data. And you can be either very liberal with determinations or very conservative. I think when we started street outreach back in like 2014 or even before 2014, when there was some rudimentary street outreach when I got here, the street outreach specialist would go to a hospitality center and hand out some business cards and count them all as street outreach contacts. So during those years, we would have like 300 people showing up in street outreach as unsheltered. Now, we're much more conservative of how we count people. We really want to know where they're sleeping and see them in a sleeping location before we contact them. So that difference also makes a difference in how many people we count. Then once we've located someone, made contact, determined that they're unsheltered, we keep following up to meet with them and build trust. And finally, connect people to services, to shelter, to coordinated entry, and other housing opportunities, looking for a positive outcome. So that's the basic process that we're using in street outreach. So now let's think about this in terms of disparity in the program. That's why we're looking at this. Where's the potential for bias inside of this program? Because bias can be very implicit, that we don't know that we have a bias. We have certain things we like or don't like, or things give certain kind of reactions to us, or we lean certain ways or don't. How might a street outreach workers or street outreach teams implicit bias affect this process? So first, let's look at locating people, right? You have to go out and find them. Are we going to the right places to look for people, or are we only going where we feel the most comfortable? If you have team members that are afraid of the woods, you'll never find anybody in the woods. If you have team members who are afraid of walking down alleys, then you're not going to meet people who are in alleys, or you're not going to engage well with people who are inside of alleys. And how do policy and procedure impact the kind of locations that we might visit and check for people? For example, we don't go on private property. So that means that if there are people on private property who are unsheltered, like in the back, we may or may not be able to actually contact them. So that's how policy could do it. Another policy involves safety, that we'll say that if a team member feels that an area is unsafe, then we have a safety code word, or the team member could just say, well, let's leave, and you don't go there if the team member doesn't feel unsafe. Well, some team members feel safe in a lot of places. Other team members might feel unsafe in some places. And a lot of times that gets to implicit bias, as well as who do you feel safe around, how safe do you feel? That's often a feeling that can be affected by a lot of things. For example, we have some street outreach workers who are very comfortable going into abandoned buildings. Not that, I know there's people in the city, maybe law enforcement, not that we would ever do that, but in theory, we might, and some people would do that, where others would be very afraid of that and say this isn't safe. So how we use safety could affect where you go, and there could be some bias that brings in disparity there. Contact. In what cases do we choose or not choose to initiate contact with somebody? In a shelter, people present, in some programs, people come and they say, we want this service, and you'll have an intake process and all of that. In street outreach, we go out and we're traveling around looking for people. And there's actually a lot of people on the streets late at night. Most of them are not homeless. How do we decide which people we're going to interact with and contact, and could there be bias in that? Making a determination. Do we equally apply unsheltered determinations to everyone? Building relationships. This gets to the outcomes part of street outreach. Are we able to build relationships across race, ethnicity, and culture that are going to result in positive outcomes? And do we connect services to people equally? So we saw these disparities in outcome, and this is what we want to start to think about as a program. How well are we doing these things? This is our process. We have policies that are related to this. Are we really doing our best to look for equity in our services? So let's just look at a hypothesis. When I started with this, I saw that there's disparities between contacts, in the number of people we saw between the total homeless population and the Black and African African population, as well as the Hispanic population. So big difference. We looked at like 44% of the homeless population was Black African American. Much smaller percentage was their component within the street outreach population. So maybe we're either not going to the right places, right? Maybe there's a location bias, is what I would call it, that we're not going someplace or not reaching those places where they are, or maybe a contact bias that there might be somebody who's there and we're not actually initiating that contact with them. Could be. So that's something I would want to look into. Then giving the disparity in program outcomes. If you'll remember, the overall program outcomes for people who are homeless was 48% for both white and Black. It was either 48 or 44, I think 48. There was parity in overall program outcomes. In street outreach, for the Black and white groups, they both increased, but not equally. There was a disparity. There was some variance that the Black African American group performed better than the white group in that. Why? And it might be that we have some relation building gaps with the white, Hispanic, multiracial, American Indian populations. Maybe we're not really connecting as well in those areas. So then let's take a look and think about these ideas of a location gap or a relationship building gap. So one of the things I want to look at first is who's doing the outreach, right? When we think about those gaps and the biases that we carry as a team, what does the team look like? And here I've broken down our outreach by race and ethnicity from 2021 up to November 2022. You can see the calendar going down there. Each row is a person. Where it's colored in is the months that they served in. So you can see if there's a red line there, that's someone who was Hispanic. A yellow line is someone who's Black, African American, African, and the sort of red line is someone who was white. So when we look at this, at the beginning of the period, this first 4 months of the reporting period that we're in now, we had a little more diversity in the team. We had 2 people who were Black, 1 who was white, and 1 who was Hispanic. Then we had some resignations, some people moved to other things, 1 person was sick, and we had less diversity in the middle period here. This is during basically the winter, early spring months from December 2021 going forward. We had a white person join the team, an experienced street outreach person. We had an African American join the team in January. But when we look at this period in the middle, it's heavily influenced by white males actually in this group, because even the Black African American African person that shows up for 3 months in January, February, March was new and really was still learning about street outreach and was afraid of some of the places, woods and things like that, and really wasn't quite as effective. So had less positive influence, I think, on the team than the 2 people who were on those first months. I think if you look at July, August, September, October, those 2 people who were Black African American, number 3 and 4, had a lot of positive influence on the team, less so of that person in the winter months. And then as we go in, we have some moving around that in November, then we have a more diverse team again with someone who's Hispanic again, and actually a Spanish speaker and different races. So a little bit of diversity there. One thing we don't see is anyone who identified as multiracial or American Indian, Alaska Native, or Indigenous. And the assumption here is that people might bring some biases with them, but also some insight into culture and being able to serve a lot of different groups. Now, locations. So street outreach, one of the things I did was I looked at all of the people we contacted and broke down these contacts by zip code. And we're just looking for 1 period. So I'm saying, okay, locations, if we have a location bias, maybe we're not popping it up. Let's start with zip codes and look from there. So I took all the locations where we had people, and then I looked what zip code they're in, and I put them in here. We only had people, I think, in 5 or 6 zip codes. We'll take a look. In Franksville up there, 53126, we had one person, and that one person was white. That was 100% of the people we had contact in that zip code. And again, we're looking July 2021 to June 2022, sorry. 53402, that's going up into Caledonia and North Bay, parts of the city of Racine there. We had 3 contacts. Again, they were all white, 100% in North Bay and that area. Actually, those contacts, although the zip code goes all the way up to Crestview, the contacts were sort of in the southern end, closer to North Beach and the river. 53404. This is around the airport, Rapid, some of those areas up there. We had 6 contacts, and these are, when I talk about contacts, these are people. So these are 6 people that we had contact with in that area, because I think we had a couple of thousand contacts over the period, but here we're talking about people. So that's 100% of them were white. They were all white. We go to 53406, Mount Pleasant. We had contact with 25 people who were white and 2 people who were black during the course. So that's 93% white, 7% black. So right away, you're starting to see, this sort of trend, this imbalance that we're seeing in those areas. Then as we come in towards the lake now, at 53405, which is Elmwood Park, up into West Racine, those areas, people were multiracial. We had 3 of them. That was 43%. Black was 3. That's 43%. White was 1. That's 14%. So a little bit more of a split there, a little more diversity. And finally, we get into 53403. White was 45 people, 66%. In 53403, we had contact with 17 people who were Black, African-American, African, 25%. Multiracial was 5 people, 7%, and Native American was 1 person, 2%. So you can see a more diversity there again in 53403. So I looked at that and said, okay, there's definitely something there about geography. So I started looking at the district. Oh, I don't want to hit that yet. Yeah, okay. So I started to look at the distribution of these people that we had contact with according to those zip codes. And what I saw was that we had disparity between, so I was looking at the population of the zip code versus the population that we had street outreach contact with within that zip code. And the variances were actually much smaller, except for 2 zip code areas. So I have a little chart there I put up. If we look at the homeless population, this is all the homeless population to the county population, the American Community Survey, that's 33% was the highest amount of difference, the biggest variance in one racial group. So within the differences between the homeless population and the county population, we had up to 33% difference in one racial group. So that's a swing of about 1/3 in there, a big change. That was the maximum disparity that we had within one group. If we looked at the annual data, again, to the county population, 37% was the maximum variance. So that means one group had a difference of 37 from the homeless population to the county population. Then I looked at the unsheltered population against the homeless population. So this is what I looked in earlier. You saw that big difference where we dropped from a large number of people who are Black, African-American, African to a smaller number in street outreach. The biggest variance or the biggest disparity we had was a 30% difference, and that was in the Black African-American group. So that 30% difference from the homeless population to the unsheltered population is about the same as the homeless population and the county population. Now, this is where it gets interesting in these bottom 2 numbers. I started taking the populations by zip code, comparing to the zip code. You can get data from zipcode.org. And it seemed like the unsheltered populations within a zip code were closer to the zip code than our overall homeless population was to our county population. So when I took the unsheltered population in HMIS to the county population and sort of did a distribution like I did in those other ones, the biggest variance or the biggest disparity was only 7%. That was in, I think, the Black African-American population. So the unsheltered population in Racine County for a whole year against the total population, the disparity was 7%. where with the homeless population, the county population was 33%. So it was interesting that the unsheltered population much more closely matched the county's population than the homeless population did. Then I sort of adjusted those zip codes and looked at our counties and adjusted 53406 because that zip code has part of it is in the city of Racine, part of it is in Mount Pleasant outside the city of Racine. I took the people who we didn't have contact with in the city out of 53406 and looked at our unsheltered population in the city of Racine versus the population of the city of Racine from census.gov. And again, the variance was only 7% as a maximum variance. Some of it was almost none. So what I saw was the unsheltered population, the distribution of race was very closely aligned to the distribution of the population in Racine, whether you're looking county to county or city to city. I'm not sure what that means, but it was something that I didn't expect. What I did see is that we had some really significant disparity in two zip codes within the city, within 53404 and 53405. 53404, we had 6 people there, they were all white, but actually the population there, there's a lot of the black, a lot of that zip code is Black, African American, and African, which is not represented in that. If everything was equal, even the way it's going with the other zip codes, I would have expected to see more people who were Black, African American, African in that data there. Then 53405, which was really interesting here, the way it's split up. Actually, there are more white people in that zip code that are underrepresented in street outreach contact. And I'm not sure why that happened, that the Black population that we had street outreach contact with or unsheltered contact with there is actually overrepresented compared to the 53405 population. I'm not sure why, again, but those are some things I noticed, that the zip codes kind of roughly approximated the populations, only 5% differences, 7% difference maximum in any zip code or county to city or whatever, except for those 2 zip codes. Another thing that just a point of interest that I thought was interesting, 53405, you see we have multiracial 43%. In 53403, we have multiracial 7%. There were 5 people there. Again, they're different groups. All of the people who reported being multiracial, all 3 of them in 53405, reported being white, American Indian, Alaska Native, Indigenous, where all of the people in 53403 who reported being multiracial were white and Black as their multiple races. So even that multiracial group is a little bit different. So it was interesting. I'm not sure whether it's relevant or not, but that's what we saw, that there's less disparity actually in street outreach to the population than the overall population. So I did it a different way. This is again looking at the zip codes. The columns there are by race. The colors are by zip code. I wouldn't worry too much about those, but the main thing you can see is that people of color were mostly in 53403 and 53405, and that people who were white in the unsheltered population appear in the most zip codes, but also there's a little column up there, or a little piece of that column at the top, which is multiple zip codes. These are people who appeared in more than one zip code during the year. We had one multiracial person who sort of crossed zip codes. We had contact in 2 places, but with the white group, it was 7 people, showing that they were both dispersed more, that unsheltered population, as well as more mobile, moving around a little bit. So that question then, seeing that mobility there, that I didn't see in the American Indian or Black, African American, African population, then made me do something else. I looked at the data in a different way. I took our street outreach data, and instead of looking at the location as a geographic location, I decided to classify our street outreach contacts, or the people that we had, by a sort of location type. And I arbitrarily came up with a couple different ones. Here, starting from the left of these graphs, is commercial space in blue. And by commercial space, I define that as staying by a store on a commercial property, behind a commercial building or something like that. The yellow one I call public structure. So what this means is that someone was sleeping or their normal sleeping place was inside of a public structure, which could be a bus shelter, parking garage, a pavilion at a public park, or something like that, some kind of structure on public land. The green section is what I'm calling public space. And these are people who are sleeping in some public space, but not inside of a structure. So around a building, around a public building someplace. There's a sort of reddish pinkish one there that's private property. Some light blue ones, which are an encampment. An encampment, I classified this a little bit different. It could be in public space, private space, or public or commercial space, and they were actually in all of those spaces. But an encampment here I'm defining as someone who built a shelter, either had a tent and set up a place to camp, or built a shelter and had a place that they actually stay sort of in a permanent or temporary basis there. Then the red one at the end are people who stayed in their vehicles, whether it's in a commercial space, public space, or on the road or whatever. So right away, when you look at this, there's a big disparity in vehicular homelessness or use of vehicles here. You'll see that the white racial group has a lot more vehicles, people are homeless, than the other groups are. That's probably the most salient difference in location type. So what I did was I took all of those people with vehicles out and I looked at location types again, and that's what I got. And when I look at this by location type, this is removing the vehicles. So all the people with the vehicles are removed. We've got three, the Black, African group at the top, white at the bottom, multiracial in the middle. You'll see that the top and bottom ones at the Black and white groups use all of those locations about the same. We had one person on private property in the white group, but otherwise very little difference in the use of commercial space, public structures, or any of those type of things there. So it's quite interesting how that worked out. Even encampments are about the same. So when we look at where we're going to look for people, it's not like we seem to be getting one group more than another in those places if we're going to commercial spaces, public structures, or whatever. The difference we see is in the multiracial group, that there is a difference there. We didn't have any of that group using a public structure during the whole year, but a few more in encampments. They're actually a larger group in encampments. And it is interesting, again, just a point of interest, that of that group, I said that it was split into two. Part of it was in 5343, part in 53405. And the part that's using the encampments there, that 29% are the 53405 group, and they're all multiracial, being white and American Indian, Alaska Native, Indigenous. So that's just interesting somehow. But what we saw is with those vehicles taken out, then there's not as much variance in where people were staying in terms of a location type. Again, the vehicular homelessness is the main factor. Otherwise, the distribution among other ones, especially between the Black and white groups, which I was investigating, is relatively negligible. Now let's look at outcomes by race. And here I'm just looking at two, Black, African American, African, and white, because I'm trying to see the difference that we saw that in their positive outcomes, they both increased. There was parity at the overall homeless population. They had the same. Both increased in terms of positive outcomes in street outreach as a percentage, but the Black African American group increased a lot more and the white less, the smaller rate of increase. So we're looking at location bias. Now we're seeing what's different here. Is there some kind of explanation we can get for the difference in positive outcomes? So these two charts, the one on the left is Black, African American, African, the one on the right is white. We have grouped exit destinations together. There are a couple of different ones. The green smiley is a positive destination. The red not happy face is a non-positive destination. So we'll see there's shelter. Black African American population use shelter 5% more than white as an exit destination. Permanent housing, about 8% more exits to permanent housing by the Black population than the white. Institutional, it was about the same. Friends and family, 4% more in the Black population compared to white. Then on the non-positive ones, jail, it's a 4% difference actually in jail, which isn't huge. The big difference is unknown destinations. So when we look at this, that's the largest disparity in street outreach exit destinations between the Black, African American, and African and the white groups is unknown destinations, or, well, it's basically data not collected. Then we don't know where they went, it's not a positive outcome. So huge difference. And that seems to be where a lot of that disparity is. So then I took all of the non-positive outcomes and said, let's take all of those non-positive outcomes, unknown destination and jail, and split them up by race. But I also added the vehicle people separately. So one thing you'll see that 50% of the non-positive outcomes are people in vehicles. You know, it's actually, yeah, it is exactly 50%, I believe. So people in vehicles account for half of the non-positive outcomes. And out of those people in vehicles that are going to unknown destinations, 86% of those people were white. So what we saw in street outreach was a lot of white people in vehicles who have poor outcomes or not positive outcomes. And one of the things that we see with people in vehicles, I won't get into it too much. If you've seen my street outreach or point in time presentations, I talk about different types of homelessness, transitional homelessness, chronic homelessness, episodic homelessness. And when I talk about transitional homelessness, it's people who are homeless for short periods of time, then they get out of homelessness one way or the other, often self-resolved. And this is often what we see with people in vehicles. They might have lost the place they're staying. They have access to an asset, to that vehicle. They're staying in the vehicle for a while. They've got a plan of how they're going to get back on their feet. And when we meet with them in street outreach, they tend not to engage much, not want assistance. They tend to be very independent and have different attitudes about homelessness even than the other people who we meet who don't live in vehicles. So often we don't even know their name. We just have them as man in and then a license plate or something like that, or woman in this license plate. And then they just disappear and we don't see them anymore. So that's where a lot of that comes from. So tentative findings, location bias. When I look at the approximate correspondence between the area demographics and the outreach contacts, there doesn't seem to be an immediate indication of location bias across Racine, or even a lot of those ones, that the percentage of people we're finding seems to line up with the population, but there's still some concerns. You know, 53404, 53405 concerns me, as well as, you know, I didn't address it so much in this as the Hispanic, Latino population is underrepresented. We might be missing people in certain areas and should look to see if we can do more outreach in those areas and try to find those blind spots and use the data to do that. Contact bias. You know, when we see people, are we making contact? Unfortunately, we don't have data to know anything about contact bias. We don't have records of the people who we didn't contact. We have started keeping records of people we're making a determination on. We sort of have a process where we make a tentative determination and then a final determination, so we could see if there's bias in that. But contact bias, we don't really know. Relationship building gaps. Vehicular homelessness seems to be the major contribution to the non-positive outcomes in street outreach. And that disparity seems to be about the gap of the disparity between the Black and white groups. So tentatively, even though I said I really would like to look at program features and so on, that might be a cause of that disparity, it looks like that might be a major cause of the disparity in outcomes, is the access to those vehicles and the number of people who are homeless in vehicles, who are actually sleeping in those vehicles outside. And I would sort of build that up by going back to our team, if you remember that middle gap, that middle period in the winter of the year, where our team was heavily influenced by white males. We had 2 white males and then an African-American who was new. The 2 white males, very experienced in street outreach, should have a lot in common. Most of those people in vehicles were white males. At least the race thing, there shouldn't be any disparity there. There might be some political differences and so on, but I wouldn't see race as being a factor in relationships. It seems to be the vehicle and the type of homelessness. But as always, more study is needed. In street outreach, we'd like to go into looking at some specific locations, really getting into the micro areas to see the differences that are there, seasonality, how that's a factor, as well as unsheltered homelessness and ethnicity. We didn't look at that. We need to do a little more research and also exploration, as we call it, during street outreach, to ensure that we're looking in the right places and not overlooking people who are unsheltered, who are Black, African-American, African, or Hispanic, Latino, Latinx, because we're not looking in the right places. Then overall, when we look at mitigating a bias in street outreach and trying to ensure equity, we have a couple of things. One is looking at team composition and diversity, trying to get as diverse a team as we can, which can be challenging. People go in and out, as you saw during the year that we looked at. Spanish speakers definitely would help. We have one now. She has a health problem and is probably going to go off the teams, and we'll be short a Spanish speaker on the team. We think that that might help us as we're trying to engage and identify people who are Hispanic, Latino, Latinx in the community who might be unsheltered. Cultural humility, which is really a commitment to self-reflection about our own cultures and how we think about the world, and also exploring other cultures and basically having empathy and openness to other people, as well as being aware that there could be some imbalances and power imbalances. And there's one thing, you know, we have some training in this. Part of it is to be aware of it and to have training, but the other is also to live it and put it in practice when we are in street outreach. Lived experience also helps people who were homeless to sort of give us more insight, or getting insight from people who were homeless. And it's interesting that a lot of times people who are on the streets point us to other people who are on the streets, but especially lived experience from people from different cultural backgrounds. As well as street outreach coverage strategy and shift plans. These are really 2 different things. A coverage strategy is looking at, you know, during a season, the summer or the winter, what areas are we going to cover? How often are we going to cover? Who's going to cover them? And a shift plan is, we're going out tonight. Who do we want to see? Where are we going to look? Really organizing those and trying to look at some underrepresented areas or uncovered areas. And then finally is contact and follow-up protocol and leads. When we see somebody or we're following up with someone, who takes the lead on that? What's the protocol? One of the things that we've really been pushing lately is when we're out in a vehicle and you're moving from one location to another, you know, your eyes are on the road, seeing if there's anyone out there. We really encourage anyone on the team to do a call out, say, hey, let's go see that person, and then just the team goes. So anybody should be sort of directing, not just waiting for the leader to say, this is where we're going, or this is where we're going. The team really needs to have influence on who we're doing it. Also, the leads and follow-up, we look at who has the best relationship and link that person up to really take the lead in difficult discussions, sometimes about shelter and housing. So that's what we're trying to do and the direction where we're going in street outreach, and hopefully that will help us maintain the best equity that we can get in our program. Still have a lot of work to do, obviously. So beyond street outreach, as we look towards moving forward with equity in our homeless services in Racine, one thing I'd like to promote again is the equity and diversity work group. Go back and revisit this work group to be focused on equity and diversity to do a few things. One is identify trends in disparity, the kind of thing that we looked at here today, but what does it look like over time? Are things changing? Are they getting better? Maybe what we looked at in this report is an anomaly and it might be different next year. We really don't know. The other is to look at those points of disparity, explore them more deeply and look for explanations. Why might this be happening? What could this be? Why is that there? Let's try to find out and gather some qualitative information from people with lived experience, actually do some interviews and evaluations to see why certain things are happening and get more insight than just ourselves. And then to propose changes to make a more equitable system of services for people experiencing homelessness in Racine. And we've tried to kick this off a couple of times, and we really are looking for someone to take the lead on it, but also people who are very much committed to this. We've had a few on and off that have come in and others have left, but we never have really gotten this work group up and running. And you don't really have to be a data geek for this. Arida, our co-chair in the System Performance Measure Committee, and the team at ICA are always able to provide various data. It's just a matter of taking the time to look at it and think about what it means. So now I am open and can take questions, comments, and suggestions. Before I do, though, I just want to recognize Arida, who wasn't here today. You know, she's incredible with this type of presentation, getting the data, and she has a real good talent of helping correct mistakes without saying that was a really stupid mistake. Also, we had some help from our committee members, Teresa Reinders and Holly Anderley, who reviewed this presentation at one point, as well as the ICA team. We had Jesse Dirkman, who's here. I don't know if Hassan Anwari and Tuli are here, but they also assisted us from ICA. So I will stop the share and hand it over to Teresa to sort of help me. If there's any questions here, you can sort of kick it in.
We do have one question, and it was related to the VI SPDAT. So the question I would add to this question is, please explain what the VI SPDAT is for those who do not understand. And then the question was, do we use the VI SPDAT? If not, do we or did we pay special attention to the assessment questions that we ask, how we ask, et cetera, to make sure they are equitable and inclusive?
All right, well, I can start on that, and then lots of people who are on here, I'm sure there's some can add in and might be able to add more. VI SPDAT is the Vulnerability Index Service Placement Decision Making Assistance Tool. And there's actually 3 different versions of it. One is for single households of just one person. Another is for transition age youth. That's youth 18 to 24 years old, and the other is for households with children. And it's an assessment that sort of indexes the vulnerability of a person. There's a lot of questions you ask. I forget the number. I just did one the other day, but there's a number of questions that you ask, and they are mostly yes or no answers, or how many times this has happened, and you record that, and it gives a score. And the answer is yes, we do use the VI SPDAT. It is part of our housing assessment process. So for someone who is referred to coordinated entry, or CE, which is our system that links people who are homeless to housing opportunities for them, the VI SPDAT assessment is part of that. Now, special attention to the assessment questions that we ask, how we ask, that might vary from person to person, you know, how well they do it. There are certain ways you're supposed to ask it, and you could lead people, which is the wrong way to do it. So that's the first part of the question, is how you actually implement that VI SPDAT. I think it probably varies from person to person. Hopefully they're doing it the way it's supposed to. The second part, however, is, are we making sure that's equitable and inclusive? And that's a whole different topic, because I think there are some questions about whether we should be using the VI SPDAT at all, and whether there could be some biases just inside the way the questions are asked. And that's always a problem with what we'd call data equity. You know, when you ask a question, is it the right question, and what kind of answer you're going to get based on people's experiences. So I can't really add too much more to that. It is a topic for question, but we do use it still.
Scott, I want to add that that would be something that we would look at the diversity and equity and inclusion group to kind of review some of our policies, our procedures, and with an equity lens, with the diversity lens and inclusion, And that's the part that doesn't necessarily require that data geek background, which is what I put in when I wrote the agenda. Is like, you don't need to be a part of that. What you need to do is have an open mind, understand cultural sensitivity and awareness as well. So
And
I see
I think
Tamara.
it's a very good point, because part of the question we want to ask is, we see these differences in outcomes by program and access to program. Are some of the questions we asking restricting access or giving different results? For example, in rapid rehousing, at Hope Center, we run a rapid rehousing program. We don't choose the people, we don't select the people who come into our program. We go to CE, we say we're looking for a single household for rapid rehousing. We get the next person who's available from coordinated entry. But that person is going to be based on a range of scores. Are those scores equitable across different races? Are they answering them the same way? We saw that the multiracial group had a much higher rate of rapid rehousing participation. Why? It's possible that those questions asked in VI Spadat were easier for them, or they responded to them certain ways that other people did. I don't know. But it's possible, and that's one of the questions to be asked. I know some COCs are asking about that. So far, we still do use it, but thanks, Teresa. Good point. That's one of the things that we should be thinking about.
And it's the main reason that we, as a COC, are using coordinated entry. We're trying to avoid having preferences of, oh, this person would be very easy to house, let's get them in, as opposed to this person who has multiple scenarios going on in their lives, which most people that are homeless, there are multiple intersections of multiple issues occurring, and they might be a little harder to place. And so, we want to avoid that. We want to avoid that at all costs. So that's why we use coordinated entry. Tamara, I see you pop on again. That was your question initially. Do you want to add anything? Can't hear you, you're muted.
No, that's fine. That's what I wanted to know, because I came from the homeless services in Minnesota, and so we actually stopped using the VI Spadat for that reason. And I mean, if you want any suggestions about what we went to, it's another service provider assessment, essentially, like a different company, but there's plenty of articles to read up on it. So I couldn't remember for this area, and I just wanted to know, like, if we're taking, that route start with people, into consideration on how we're asking, what we're asking, and make sure, just that we're being inclusive of that, right from the start. So thank you for answering my question.
You're welcome. Are there any other questions?
This is Irma. Can you hear me?
Yes, Irma.
Yeah, I just want to ask Scott, with some of that data, when I put in some people from HMIS, I noticed from street outreach, when you come in contact with them, there's sometimes a gap. Do you get information from when you contact them to when they finally get into shelter? What happens to them in between that time you get that contact to the time they finally make it into the shelter? What happened to them in between?
Sometimes, yeah. What we use in street outreach, once we determine that someone is unsheltered, that's when we do what in HMIS and our data is called an enrollment. We enroll them into street outreach. And for street outreach, they don't necessarily consent to that. We keep that as a sort of private, closed data in there that's not shared initially. And then each time we come into contact with them from that point, we enter something that's called a current living assessment that will have the date of contact and then the location of contact. So that's how I got the information about the where people were located and so on. And we also usually enter in a note that's also not shared. So a lot of that stuff, Irma, you can't see at shelter because it's closed, it's not shared, but it is actually there. So we do track that stuff. Usually it's possible that we might lose contact with them and then they go into shelter with a gap between we actually saw them. But part of that gap that you're seeing might have notes and information on our side that isn't shared. So we do keep information, yeah.
Okay, thanks.
And that's a good point too, Scott. You know, there's a fine line between, as opposed to thinking of helping people, we need to think about serving people. We are servants, and there's that line of respecting their wishes, but also as a service provider to maintain some information to be able to serve the people that you reach out to appropriately. So there's that delicate walk to respecting people's privacies, but at the same time trying to provide them with any services that they need. And interesting, the dance that you said where you might have them described, because you don't have a name, as man with in green car on such and such, or man in car with license plate. So to maintain anonymity and confidentiality.
Well, yeah, and there's two things with it. One, for the most part, when we meet someone, we don't know their name, and a lot of times we don't ask, and we would never probe. You know, in street outreach, you don't meet someone and say, "Yeah, could you give me your name, your date of birth, security, what race do you identify?" No, we don't do that at all. So that's part of it. Is a that relationship building starts right from the start. The privacy part is that we don't share the data in HMIS, and that's why Irma couldn't see it. So I think that's a really good point. There's two parts to that. One, because we didn't have them do a release, so we don't say, "Hey, could we share this information with someone?" And so we don't share it because of that. If they enter coordinated entry, then they become what we call engaged in street outreach, which means they've agreed to services. Then that information can be shared. But up until that point, we don't share it. But then also from a street outreach sort of code, we don't tell tales. So that's part of how you engage with people. I'm not going to tell you where we've located specific people and things like that. And that builds our trust with the people that we serve, that, you know, they're not going to be sold out, or we're not going to compromise our location. So there's a lot of stuff. The names are interesting. Even as a process, we're starting to get better protocols for how we name people so that we don't have duplication. You know, we used to have we ran into a period where we had lots of woman in white vans. You know, once we had 3 of those at the same time, how do you get the difference? We use license plates where we can. And we're also really working on coming up with a sort of an area and location registry so that we use the same names. It's another problem in street outreach. One team might call a place Upper Deck, another place might call it the Slab, another place might have another name for the same place. It looks like 3 different places, it's the same place. So we're trying to sort of codify that so that we can use that information to be able to do this kind of assessment. Yeah. Anything else?
I did put in the chat, HMIS stands for Homeless Management Information System. In case you're wondering, we tend to use these abbreviations a lot. Scott, as long as you're talking about street outreach, how about a pitch for point in time, when it's occurring and
Sure.
what it involves?
Sure. Point in time, we actually saw some point in time data in this presentation. That's where we get our annual count of people who are homeless, experiencing homelessness in Racine, and we break it down by race and ethnicity and other things like that. We learn a lot, and that was one of the foundational pieces of data that I used here. Our next point in time count will be on Wednesday, January 25th. We expect registration to start sometime in December. Our point in time work group has been working and starting to organize this. And this point in time, we will be back to using community volunteers. So people will be able to volunteer and be placed on a point in time team. We're doing the pandemic. We used a strategy of leveraging existing street outreach teams. Just street outreach did point in time for a few point in times. Last year we had agency teams. January 2023, community is back. So we'll go through all of that. It's January 25th. You can look at the CoC website for updates.
And rumor has it, when you have meetings, you have treats.
If you're there in person.
Yes, in person. Yes. So do we have any further questions for Scott on the data presented, or on street outreach in general, or even for the point in time count?
I see a hand from Mary Beth. I can't hear you.
What a great job you did with this presentation. It shows that you took a lot of time. You looked at every aspect. I'm like, that was amazing. This information was just incredible. So thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thanks. There's still lots more ways to look at it. I mean, really, it's very interesting because, you know, I got set off initially, you know, these red flags started going out, looking at the homeless population and then the street outreach population. I thought, wow, this is terrible. Then when I looked at the street outreach population against the county population, it was almost the same. I couldn't believe it. You know, to me, there's some surprises that come out of here. And then the question is, then there's a huge gap in shelter. Why is the difference between shelter and street outreach? What does it mean? Are we underreaching, or is shelter serving other groups more or something? So there's a lot more implications. And whenever you look at it, it just brings up more and more questions, first of what's going on, and then, you know, you can always go deeper. So that's why we really hope that we can get some people who are committed to looking at equity in our services and really push this issue. Some people who are really motivated for that. So thanks so much for that. I'm also presenting this on equipment that we got from the United Way Technology grant as well. So thanks for that.
The owl, the owl.
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
All right,
Well,
thank you.
that was an awesome presentation. We appreciate all the hard work of the committee that went into it, mostly Scott and ICA group, and Melissa Taggart was there as well.
All right, Melissa was there, but Arida. Yeah,
And Arida, yes.
Yeah, Arida.
Arida is on a
Arida.
well-deserved vacation. She's time off right now. Yes, she provides us with the data, but this is something that we can continue to go to the system performance, which is just that, system performance, and between Arida requesting data and some of the Stella data that HUD gives us a lot of tools, we can do a deep dive into some of these areas, and that's what we're hoping to do for through the next year, is to pull up some of these and answer questions. I am looking for volunteers to put together a group that will connect the monitoring, evaluation, and rating and ranking. Those are 3 areas that we can look at services, and so some of the things that we will look at with services, again, reaches out towards the system performance and some of the HUD data and says, you know, are we really doing what we think we're doing? And the goal is not to expand the goal for our community from the CoC Alliance, Homelessness Housing Alliance, is to provide that ultimate outcome for people that are experiencing or at risk of experiencing homelessness, and that is eventual permanent support housing, or permanent housing. That's what we want, permanent housing. So at some point in the new year, we will also have a presentation that looks at the way that we have been able to extend through working partnerships with the Racine County Housing Authority, and provide Section 8 vouchers, and for WIDA with the emergency housing vouchers, how we've been able to get people access to their own apartments. And the hardest part of that is, at this point, is finding available apartments. So we're looking at that. Let me see, trying to see, Darlene, you're on here, aren't you? Darlene, where are you, Darlene? Say yes. Is my newest counterpart, my coworker, and she will be connecting with some of you. So if you see Darlene's name in there more and more, she's wave hi, Darlene. There she is. She's my counterpart. She and I will be doing more and more work reaching out and getting people. So if we don't have any more questions about this, let me just ask real briefly, do we have anybody that wants to share any information, any events that are coming up
Teresa, I will.
Okay,
I'm Mary Beth. I work for United Way of Racine County. I'm the Community Investment Director here. And on December 1st from 9 a.m. to 11 a.m., we have scheduled the Community Annual Investment Meeting. So what's that? That's when we talk about our upcoming request for proposal that requesting money for funding July 1st, 23 to June 30th, 24. And if you're interested in United Way funding, I would highly attend. If you're interested in annual investment funding, I should say. So that's a 1-year grant. So that will happen on December 1st. And you know what? I can put the link in the chat right now too as well. That was my update.
perfect. Thank you. Okay. Any other comments? This was a long meeting, but that was for us to be able to provide some information. Kaylee, are you wanting to add something?
Yeah, I worked with some fantastic women in Dane County's Madison area. We actually wrote a proclamation and got Evers to declare November Wisconsin Homelessness Awareness Month. So it's officially like a month. So for the rest of November, Journal Times just did a little story for Racine Unified and what we're doing in regards to our homeless kiddos. If you guys wanted to read that, but we did an event at the Capitol, and there are like signs and a display up at the Capitol for the rest of the month if anyone is in that area and wants to check it out.
Thank you. And Kaylee will now be taking over as the chair of the Racine CoC. So that's exciting. We're happy to see that. Any other comments or things to share?
I'll share.
Oh, Jory?
Oh, sorry. So I just wanted to let everyone know that WRC's Safe Start program is up and running, and we're starting to enter into Racine Unified School District. That program provides information about healthy relationships and, you know, that type of thing for teens. And we're starting, well, technically it's 10 to 18. So we're starting to get back into the school district. So that's really cool. That was thanks to the governor's grant as well. So yay. But just so you guys know.
Wonderful. Also, as a reminder, now that I don't think it's still snowing, I can't tell. Just so everybody knows, I did reach out to the city and the county to find out about warming centers. And just as a reminder, Racine County, throughout Racine City and County, we do not have warming shelters. We have places such as Hospitality Center or Hope Center. The shelters themselves, such as Halo, do not push people out into the cold during the days when it's especially frigid and the weather's bad. But we do have, I have not heard from the county yet, but we do have a list from the city of warming centers. And warming centers, I will have that list on our website. The warming centers are for anyone. They're not just for people who are experiencing homelessness or at risk of homelessness. But if you have anybody, or you find out of anybody, say their heat goes out and they need a place to go while they're waiting for it to be repaired, please check with our list. And also, I believe our WERA funding is still, Nicole, are you still on here? From Racine Community Action Agency.
I am, and we are still actively accepting applications for WERA funding. And I'm sorry, I still am learning all the programs, so I don't remember all the specifics, but there is information on our website, which is rkca.org, or you guys can, if anyone wants to call and contact Zeke Leo, he can give you all those details. And I guess while I'm on, a reminder, we are still accepting applications as well for our holiday baskets for families that are looking for holiday food items. And that can be done on site here or by phone. And that's through December 9th. We're accepting those applications for delivery of the baskets or pickup it's in December. I believe it's the week of the 12th, but I can double check that if you need.
And do you handle the energy assistance?
We do not. I do believe
Okay.
energy assistance is through the state now, that there's an application
Okay.
through the state website, but we do weatherization. So if someone applies for energy assistance, they can get referred over to weatherization through our program. I do believe they have to apply for or energy assistance in order to qualify for WERA, if I'm remembering
Well,
correctly.
that's what I thought. That's why I was thinking maybe the connection was there. We'll find that out and post that on our website as well for people who may have, who know of people who may need to connect to that.
Yeah, there is a link to energy assistance information on our website under the WERA program. I'm posting a link directly to that page in the chat.
Thank you.
Yes.
Appreciate that. And I see Jesse Dirkman has posted, there's a recording of the Homelessness Awareness Month presentation at the Capitol. So thank you, that's in the chat. Tamara, you have your hand.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, so I attended a work group for HAP, which is a committee of the Emergency Services Network in Kenosha, and it's a discharge plan committee. And we had some talks about inviting service providers from Racine to kind of join in this discussion so that we can streamline everyone who's accepts people who are re-entering into society and from being incarcerated, and what the best procedures and policies would be for that, as well as just who's the community players. And because, you know, generally people can go between Racine and Kenosha, right? Like we have the same kind of population and when they get released. And so I just want to throw that out there. If anybody's interested, I'll put my email in the chat and I can pass it on to the chair of that work group. But yeah, if you have interest in being part of the work group for discharge planning so we can better serve people coming out of incarceration, just shoot me an email.
And that is perfect. We do have Carl Fields and we have Lori Bauer, and both are connected within probation parole and then working with people who have been released from incarceration. So yeah, just send the information and that would be great. Appreciate it. Okay. Any others? Any others? Well, everybody, I appreciate you being here this morning. I am hoping that eventually we will get to the point where we can have hybrid meetings. Although on mornings like today, I'm happy that we're doing it via Zoom, I have to say. And thank you all for attending, for listening, for asking, for sharing. And let's walk out of the committee of this meeting being thankful for everything that we have and that we are all in a position where we can offer services and share with any individuals who are struggling or concerned about where they're going to find their next meals, their next place to stay. Scott, thank you so much for your presentation and the information on the point in time that will be coming up. All of this will be in the minutes. Mary Beth Callio has agreed to continue being the minute taker, note taker for our Alliance meetings that we have, and I appreciate that. And everyone else, we'll see you in January, if not before, for committee meetings. Okay, I'm going to officially close this meeting by asking for a motion to close the meeting.
I motion to close the meeting.
And do we have a second? I'm not gonna let
I'll
y'all go.
second Jory Chambers.
Thank you, Jory. Okay, is there anybody who wants to abstain from the vote? Anybody voting no? If not, all those in favor of adjourning, please log off.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Mary Beth, did she log off? Do you need to stay and say anything with me to check in? Nope, I guess she just left. Okay, thank you, everybody.